The Emu War was one of the silliest military decisions of all time. The Australian military taking action against its own national bird. But there have been a lot of misconceptions regarding the subject, and I'm here to clear them up. In this video, we're going to look at what caused the war and the events leading up to it, the public's response to the war, and how, if at all, it affected the Australian economy. The story of the Great Emu War of 1932 doesn't actually start in 1932, but instead starts in the Great War, or more formally known as World War I. You see, when Great Britain declared war on Germany, all of her colonies and territories were automatically involved as well. These colonies sent troops to help fight in the war, hoping to gain more independence, and the same is true for Australia. With a population of over 5 million, more than 400,000 men volunteered to fight. These men fought overseas, conditions at home worsened as a result of the war. The Australian economy relied heavily on exports, 60% of which went to Great Britain. However, during the war, exports of wheat and wool dropped significantly as key markets became unavailable, droughts hurt production, the war took sources of labors, and countries like the United States, Canada, and Argentina began to produce an agricultural surplus. After the war, the economy still was unable to go back to what it was before, as Australia funded its war effort by increasing the money supply, causing major inflation. Not to mention a £5.5 million debt to pay, which in today's money, in US dollars, is $495.7 billion. And in the middle of all of this, Australia also had to find a way to reintegrate veterans into society. Having lost 60,000 men, 156,000 wounded or taken prisoner, this became an extremely difficult task, especially considering the state of the economy, making it even harder for most people to even make a living. The Australian government needed to fix this, and fix it fast. So they came up with the Soldier Settlement Act. This act gave land out west to any returning veterans who had been a member of the Australian Imperial Forces or any other forces formed in Australia who served overseas and was honorably discharged. The hope was that these veterans would be able to farm the land and be able to compete in the global market. In theory, this act would help solve reintegration, giving the veterans jobs, while also helping the recovery of the economy. However, it failed to do either. See, most of the returning soldiers had little to no experience in agriculture. On top of this, the land in Western Australia is difficult to farm. Yields were low, and the farmers were only able to make enough to barely get by. Then, of course, when Australia is at its lowest, the Great Depression hits. Unemployment rates skyrockets. Crops sold for very little, the economy plunged even further into peril. Australia was one of the countries hardest hit by the Depression, and this is because of all the factors mentioned before. As these poor, inexperienced farmers continued to struggle to make ends meet, they would encounter yet another roadblock. Emus. 5'7", 110 pounds, and about 20,000 of them. They devastated farmlands and the crops they grew, costing millions of pounds of property damage. The farmers, unable to do anything, turned to George Pierce, the Minister of Defense, and asked for his help. George Pierce thought it would be some good PR for the government and be a good aim training exercise for the soldiers. Now, when most people imagine the Emu War, and you say, oh, Australia went to war with the emus, they imagine that the military went out with tanks and a whole army, running bravely at the emus. In reality, he devised an operation where Sergeant S. McMurray and Gunner J. O'Halloran, under the command of Major Medworth of the Royal Australian Artillery, would go out with 2 Lewis machine guns to kill the emus. The first attempt, and yes, I did say first, they fired on a herd from far away, and they weren't able to really kill that many. The second attempt, they snuck up close behind a different herd, a much larger herd. This was more successful. However, both the guns jammed at the same time after only a few seconds, so they weren't able to kill as many as they would have. And at this point, the whole military taking action against emus was being picked up by the media. The media framed this whole operation as an embarrassing defeat, personifying the birds, saying that they had ranks in their flocks, like a leader that would stand and guard while the others were distracted, and that they had the sturdiness of tanks, tanking 10 rounds per confirmed kill. And this isn't a good representation of how strong the birds were, as the Lewis gun shoots at 10 rounds a second, and as it's a full auto weapon, most of these shots never hit anything. Still, it was not a good look for the military that they were losing to emus. So, George Pierce called off the operation, having only killed some 300 emus. With the operation now concluded, what was to be done with the emus? The farmers had a fantastic idea. They went to George Pierce, the Minister of Defense, to take action against the emus. That's a great idea! Wait, didn't we literally just try that? However, more pressures from the farmers meant that they were going out for round 2. Now, there actually isn't a ton of information regarding the second round, as the media was largely moved on to other things, but they did seem to have a bit more success than last time, with around 1,000 emus killed by the end. The operation was still nowhere near a success, but they had killed a decent amount. The operation was called off because it was stupid and a waste of money for the government. The government then tried to create boundaries for the emus and provided farmers with the means to deal with them themselves. This did work a lot better, however, the damage to the reputation of the Department of Defense was already done. The war did little to nothing to improve the economy, emus were still destroying crops, and unemployment rates were the exact same. So that is the time Australia went to war with its own national bird. It didn't change anything in the long run, and was a huge embarrassment and mostly a PR stunt, but they would soon be forced to forget about the whole thing, as a German maniac with a silly mustache would soon be taking over half the world.